December 1942. A cold wind sweeps across the snow-covered Don steppes. Here, on the banks of the frozen Don, the fate not only of the Battle of Stalingrad, but of the entire war is being decided. Paulus's Sixth Army is encircled in Stalingrad by a ring of Soviet troops, but Hitler has no intention of surrendering. Army Group Don, under the command of Field Marshal Manstein, launches Operation Winter Storm, an attempt to relieve the encircled grouping. However, standing in the way of the German counterattack's success is a weak link: the stretched positions of the Italian Eighth Army and other Axis allies along the Don. The Soviet command unerringly identifies this vulnerability. Operation Little Saturn is conceived as a powerful strike precisely against these Allied forces.
We'll cut them off at the pass,
The strategic concept is simple and brilliant at the same time. Instead of a frontal clash with German tank divisions, to defeat their allies, creating a threat to the rear and communications of the entire Army Group Don. This is a classic example of military art, to strike not at the fortress, but at its weakest wall. By the end of 1942, the situation on the Eastern Front resembled a chess game, where each piece had its own value. German divisions represented queens and rooks, powerful, well-armed formations with experienced commanders. But next to them on the board stood the Allied forces, Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian units, which could be compared to pawns. Numerous, but vulnerable. After the defeats near Moscow in the winter of 1941, Hitler demanded greater participation from his satellites in the war against the Soviet Union. By December 1942, 22 Romanian, 10 Italian, 10 Hungarian, and 1 Slovak division were on the Soviet-German front. A quarter of all Axis forces on the Eastern Front consisted of these Allied contingents. But the quality of these troops left much to be desired. The Italian Eighth Army, Armir, under the command of General Italo Garibaldi, numbered about 230,000 men. Romanian troops, about 250,000. The Hungarian Second Army, approximately 200,000. Impressive figures concealed serious problems. The armament of Germany's allies was significantly inferior to that of Germany and the Soviet Union. Italian infantry used outdated 1891 model rifles and light machine guns from the First World War era. Anti-tank artillery was represented by 47mm guns, incapable of penetrating the armor of Soviet T-34s. The tank fleet consisted of light vehicles, which Soviet soldiers contemptuously called tin cans. Things were no better for the Romanians and Hungarians. Romanian artillery suffered from a severe shortage of ammunition. Hungarian units were poorly motorized. The situation was exacerbated by the Russian winter, for which the soldiers from southern countries were completely unprepared. The Italians received winter uniforms only in January 1943, when for many, it was already too late. The morale of Germany's Allied troops also left much to be desired. Unlike the Germans, Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian soldiers did not understand what they were fighting for in distant Russia. Letters home were full of longing and disappointment. "We are thrown here like cannon fodder," wrote one Italian sergeant to his family in November 1942. The German command was well aware of the low combat effectiveness of its allies. General Kurt Zeitzler reported to Hitler, "Italian and Romanian divisions will not withstand a serious Russian blow." However, the Führer ignored this warning. Moreover, it was these unreliable troops who were entrusted with the defense of a huge sector of the front along the Don, about 500 kilometers. In the summer of 1942, Mussolini made a fateful decision: to increase the Italian contingent on the Eastern Front. The small expeditionary corps, sent to Russia a year earlier, transformed into a full-fledged Eighth Army, Armata Italiana in Russia, or Armir for short. The Duce sought to demonstrate his loyalty to Hitler and secure a seat at the table of future victors. The price of these ambitions proved exorbitant. By December of '42, the Italian grouping on the Don numbered approximately 230,000 men. It comprised 3 Army Corps, the 2nd, the 35th, and the elite Alpine. In total, 10 divisions, among which the Alpine divisions Tridentina, Giulia, and Cuniense, mountain riflemen, hardened in battles in the Alps, were a particular source of Italian pride. But even these elite units were not prepared for what awaited them on the banks of the Don. The Italian army suffered from a chronic shortage of everything: winter uniforms, fuel, ammunition. Armier's tank fleet looked like a museum exhibit compared to Soviet T-34s. Only about 70 light L-6 40th tanks with bulletproof armor and weak 20mm cannons. The Italians' anti-tank artillery was represented by outdated 47mm guns, which the soldiers bitterly nicknamed knockers. The shells literally knocked on the armor of Soviet tanks without causing them harm. The Germans allocated a small number of modern anti-tank guns to their allies, but these were catastrophically insufficient. Italian infantry was armed with Carcano rifles of the 1891 model. Automatic weapons were rare. Communication means were primitive. Transportation was primarily horse-drawn. The Savoia Cavalry Division used horses not only for movement, but also for attacks. An anachronism in the age of motorized armies. The German command placed Italian troops on the middle course of the Don, on a sector stretching approximately 270 kilometers. On Armour's flanks were the Hungarian Second Army and German units. The Italians were given the thankless role of holding a stretched defensive line with minimal reserves and weak artillery support. In German operational plans, the Italian grouping was to play the role of a shield, covering the left flank of Army Group Don during the operation to relieve Stalingrad. In fact, the fate of Paulus's encircled 6th Army depended on the Italians' ability to hold their positions on the Don. General Garibaldi and his staff understood the precariousness of their situation. In their reports to Rome, they repeatedly pointed out the stretched front and insufficient forces. But Mussolini, obsessed with the idea of an equal partnership with Hitler, ignored these warnings. The Duce demanded only victorious communiques from his generals, not a sober assessment of the situation. By early December 1942, the Soviet Supreme High Command faced a strategic dilemma. The success of Operation Uranus had led to the encirclement of Paulus's forces in Stalingrad, but the Germans had no intention of surrendering. Field Marshal Manstein began assembling forces for a relief strike, Operation Winter Storm. Time was working against the Soviet side. A decision was needed that would not only thwart German plans, but also build upon the success of the Stalingrad counteroffensive. Initially, the Stavka developed a plan for Operation Saturn, a large-scale strike from the Middle Don to Rostov with the aim of cutting off the entire German grouping in the Caucasus. This was an ambitious idea that could have led to a strategic catastrophe for the entire southern wing of the Wehrmacht. However, developments forced adjustments. On December 12th, the German counterattack began from the Kotelnikovo area. Manstein's tank divisions rushed towards Stalingrad. Under these circumstances, the Stavka made a wise decision: to reduce the scope of the original plan but accelerate its implementation. Thus, the plan Little Saturn was born. The General Staff, led by Alexander Vasilevsky and Georgy Zhukov, proposed striking not towards Rostov, but in a southeastern direction, towards Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk. This strike was shorter but no less effective. It brought Soviet troops into the rear of Manstein's grouping, cutting it off from the main forces of the Wehrmacht. A key element of the strategic design was the choice of the direction of the main strike. The Soviet command unerringly identified the weakest link in the enemy's positions: the Italian 8th Army. Instead of attacking well-fortified German positions, it was decided to unleash the full might against Hitler's allies. This decision reflected a deep understanding of the principle of economy of force. As General Nikolai Vatutin, commander of the Southwestern Front, noted, We don't need to bash our heads against German armor. It's enough to collapse the flanks, and the whole structure will crumble. The Stavka allocated significant forces for the operation. 6 combined arms armies, 2 tank corps, 2 mechanized corps, 17 separate tank brigades. The strike group numbered more than 500,000 personnel, 2,600 tanks, 16,000 guns and mortars. This was a concentration of forces capable of sweeping aside any resistance. By mid-December 1942, preparations for Operation Little Saturn entered a decisive phase. 2 Soviet fronts, the Southwestern, under the command of General Nikolai Vatutin, and the Voronezh, led by General Philip Golikov, concentrated impressive forces in the breakthrough sectors. The main striking power was concentrated on the Southwestern Front, which was to deliver the main blow against the positions of the Italian Eighth Army. The strike group of the Southwestern Front included the 1st Guards Army of General Vasily Kuznetsov, the 3rd Guards Army of General Dmitry Lelyushenko, and the 6th Army of General Fyodor Haratonov. The Voronezh Front allocated its 1st Army to participate in the operation. In total, 24 rifle divisions, 2 rifle brigades, and 19 tank units were to participate in the offensive. A special role in the upcoming operation was played by mobile formations, the 24th and 25th Tank Corps, and the 1st and 8th Mechanized Corps. It was they who were to develop a tactical breakthrough into an operational success, rapidly advancing deep into the enemy's defenses. Tank units numbered more than 700 combat vehicles, among which medium T-34 tanks and light T-70 tanks predominated. The artillery preparation for the breakthrough was planned with particular care. In the directions of the main attacks, the Soviet command created a high density of artillery, up to 150 barrels per kilometer of front. This guaranteed the suppression of enemy firing points in a short time. Reactive mortar units, the famous Katyushas, which struck terror into the enemy, were concentrated to support the offensive. Air support for the operation was assigned to the 17th Air Army and long-range aviation. Despite the difficult meteorological conditions of the winter period, Soviet pilots were to provide cover for the advancing troops and strike at enemy reserves. Special attention was paid to masking the preparations. The command understood that success depended on the surprise of the blow. Redeployments were carried out only at night, radio traffic was minimized, and false concentration areas were created. Enemy intelligence was unable to uncover the true scale of the impending offensive. In the direction of the main attack, the Soviet command created almost a 3-fold superiority in manpower, a 5-fold superiority in artillery, and an absolute superiority in tanks. Against the Italian divisions, armed with outdated anti-tank weapons, hundreds of Soviet tanks, supported by powerful artillery, were preparing for the assault. December 16, 1942, began in the Don steppes with the deafening roar of Soviet artillery. Exactly at 8:30 in the morning, more than 16,000 guns and mortars unleashed their power on the positions of the Italian Eighth Army. The earth trembled. The snow cover mingled with black fountains of explosions. The artillery preparation continued for an hour and a half, methodically grinding down the enemy's first line of defense. Italian soldiers, pressed into the frozen ground of their trenches, experienced a genuine shock. Nothing in their previous combat experience had prepared them for such hell. It seemed as if the sky itself was falling on our heads. Captain Eugenio Corti of the Alpine Division, Tridentina, later recalled. Communication between units was disrupted in the very first minutes. Command posts were cut off from advanced units. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the artillery fire suddenly shifted deeper into the defense, and Soviet infantry went on the attack. Rifle divisions of the 1st Guards Army of General Kuznetsov, supported by tank brigades, rushed to the positions of the Italian 35th Army Corps. Simultaneously, units of the 6th Army of General Karatonov struck the right flank of the Italians. The first line of Italian defense was breached by noon. The Ravenna division, which bore the brunt of the Soviet attack, practically ceased to exist as an organized force. Its commander, General Dupré, died trying to organize a counterattack. The neighboring Pasubio division was also cut into isolated pockets of resistance. By the end of the first day of the offensive, Soviet troops had advanced 10 to 15 kilometers deep, breaking through the Italian tactical defense zone. Into the resulting gap, the command of the Southwestern Front immediately introduced mobile formations, the 24th Tank and 1st Mechanized Corps. Attempts by the Italian command to organize a counterattack proved unsuccessful. Reserves were scattered and weak. Italian anti-tank artillery proved powerless against Soviet T-34s. 47mm anti-tank guns, nicknamed knockers by the Italians, could not penetrate the armor of Soviet tanks even at close range. Panic began to spread among Italian units with terrifying speed. Many units simply abandoned their positions and retreated without orders. "The Russians have broken through the front. Russian tanks are in our rear." These rumors were passed from unit to unit, increasing chaos and disorganization. The commander of the Italian 8th Army, General Garibaldi, receiving contradictory reports from the front, could not form a clear picture of what was happening. His headquarters in Milerovo was threatened with encirclement on the very first day of the Soviet offensive. In a panicked report to Rome, Garibaldi stated, "The situation is critical. The front has been breached over a wide sector. There are no reserves." The German command, having received information about the Soviet breakthrough in the Italian sector, was forced to urgently transfer units there from other directions. However, this was not possible to do quickly. Manstein was faced with a dilemma: continue the operation to relieve Stalingrad, or save the collapsing Italian front. December 17th became the day of the complete collapse of the Italian defense on the Don. Soviet tank and mechanized corps, having broken through the gap in the first line, rushed into the operational depth. The pace of the offensive reached 30 kilometers per day, an unprecedented speed for winter operations. The Italian 8th Army literally crumbled under this swift onslaught. The elite Alpine division, Ravenna, the pride of the Italian armed forces, found itself completely encircled by the end of December 17th. 15,000 Alpine riflemen, hardened in mountain battles but absolutely unprepared for steppe warfare, fell into a deadly cauldron. The division commander, General Ettore Martini, refused to surrender and ordered a breakthrough to the west. However, mobile Soviet tank units intercepted the columns of retreating Italians, dismembering them into isolated groups. The tactics of Soviet mechanized formations during these days deserve special attention. Tank brigades operated not in a continuous front, but in mobile tactical groups. Each such group included 10 to 15 tanks, reinforced by motorized infantry on trucks and anti-tank artillery. These groups bypassed resistance strongholds, cut communications, attacked headquarters and enemy rear establishments. The Italians, accustomed to linear tactics, were completely unprepared for such maneuver warfare. On December 18th, Soviet tanks of General Rusyanov's 1st Mechanized Corps broke into operational space. Having covered over 60 kilometers in 2 days, they found themselves deep in the rear of the Italian army. The commander of the Italian 8th Army, General Garibaldi, gave the order for a general retreat, but it was already too late. Communication between the corps was lost, and there was no unified command of the troops. The 2nd Italian Army Corps, attempting an organized withdrawal, was overtaken by units of the 24th Tank Corps in the area of Kantemirovka village. An unequal battle ensued. Italian 47mm anti-tank guns were powerless against Soviet T-34s. Only individual crews, armed with German 75mm guns, offered effective resistance. By the end of December 19th, practically nothing remained of the Italian Eighth Army as an organized force. Dispersed groups of Italian soldiers, having lost contact with command, trudged across the snow-covered steppe to the west. Many surrendered. Others froze in the endless dawn steppes. The temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero, and most Italians were dressed in summer uniforms. The fate of the Italian Artillery Division, the only fully motorized division of Armée, turned out to be particularly tragic. Surrounded in the Chertkovo area, it was almost completely destroyed. Out of 12,000 men, about 8,000 were taken prisoner. The rest died in battles or froze while attempting to break through. Soviet tank crews who captured the division headquarters were struck by the contrast between the luxury of the officers' dugouts and the miserable condition of the ordinary soldiers. By the end of December 1942, the Italian Eighth Army had ceased to exist as an organized military force. The scale of the catastrophe astonished even battle-hardened Soviet commanders. Of the 10 divisions that comprised Armée, 8 were completely destroyed or captured. Only parts of the Alpine Corps retained some combat effectiveness, but they too were doomed to perish during the subsequent Soviet offensive. The total Italian losses amounted to approximately 130,000 killed, wounded, and captured, more than half of the entire personnel. Almost all artillery, motor transport, and heavy weaponry were abandoned on the battlefields. Soviet troops captured over 1,000 artillery pieces, tens of thousands of rifles, and enormous stockpiles of ammunition and provisions. But even these dry figures do not convey the full drama of what transpired. The Italian army did not merely suffer a defeat, it endured a genuine human tragedy. Thousands of soldiers, abandoned by their commanders, wandered through the snow-covered steppes, dying from frostbite and hunger. Lieutenant Nuto Ravelli, one of the few officers of the Alpine Division Tridentina who managed to return to Italy, wrote in his memoirs, "I saw hell on earth. People turned into ice statues. The wounded begged to be shot to avoid further suffering. Officers lost their minds and shot themselves in front of their soldiers." Soviet General Moskalenko, who commanded one of the armies participating in the operation, noted in his memoirs, "I have never seen so many frostbitten prisoners. Many Italians had amputated limbs. They were dressed for summer, in thin greatcoats and boots with puttees. In 30-degree frost, this was tantamount to a death sentence." The reasons for such a catastrophic defeat of the Italians were complex. First and foremost, the technical backwardness of the Italian army played a role. Anti-tank artillery from the 1920s was powerless against Soviet tanks. Light L6/40 tanks with 20mm cannons could not stand against T-34s. But it wasn't just about technology. Serious miscalculations were also made by the Italian command. General Garibaldi, commander of Armée, failed to create a deeply echeloned defense. Reserves were scattered across the entire front rather than concentrated in dangerous directions. When the Soviet breakthrough began, the Italians had no forces for a counterattack. The rout of the Italian Eighth Army had catastrophic consequences for the entire Army Group Don, commanded by Field Marshal Manstein. The resulting 200-kilometer breach in the front line threatened the rear and communications of German troops attempting to relieve Paulus's encircled group in Stalingrad. Operation Winter Storm, launched by Manstein on December 12th, was now in jeopardy. The German command faced an agonizing choice: continue the offensive toward Stalingrad or redeploy forces to close the breakthrough that had occurred after the Italians' defeat. Field Marshal Manstein, in his post-war memoirs, admitted, "The catastrophe on the Italian sector of the front put an end to all our plans for relieving the Sixth Army. We found ourselves in the position of a man trying to reach out to a drowning person, while the ground was slipping from under his own feet." On December 23rd, Manstein was forced to make the painful decision to halt Operation Winter Storm and begin withdrawing Hoth's Panzer Group, which had by then advanced to within only 40 kilometers of Stalingrad's outer encirclement ring. The SS Panzer Divisions, Viking, and Das Reich received orders to urgently redeploy westward to close the breach formed after the Italians' defeat. This meant the ultimate collapse of hopes for saving Paulus's Sixth Army. Hitler, upon receiving the report on the cessation of Operation Winter Storm, flew into a rage. A dramatic direct-line conversation took place at the headquarters of Army Group Dawn between the Führer and Manstein. "You must continue the offensive at all costs," Hitler demanded. "My Führer, it is impossible," Manstein replied. "If we do not close the breach formed after the Italians' defeat, we risk losing not only the Sixth Army, but also the entire Army Group Dawn. Soviet tank corps are already deep in our rear." Hitler was forced to agree with the Field Marshal's arguments. But instead of permission for the Sixth Army to break out of the encirclement, he sent Paulus a radio message. "The Sixth Army will fulfill its duty to the last soldier and the last cartridge." This was effectively a death sentence for 300,000 German soldiers trapped in the Stalingrad cauldron. The rout of the Italian Eighth Army led to the complete disorganization of the German rear. Soviet tank and mechanized corps, capitalizing on their success, rushed southeast to Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk. On December 24th, General Badanov's tank crews captured the airfield at Tatsinskaya, the last air artery connecting Paulus's encircled group with the outside world. The aerial supply of the Stalingrad cauldron was finally paralyzed. Developing the success of Operation Little Saturn, the Soviet command decided not to rest on its laurels. On December 24th, 42, the mobile formations of the Southwestern Front received a new task: to advance in the direction of Milerovo, a vital transport hub and strongpoint of the German defense. The capture of this city opened prospects for a further offensive on Rostov and created a threat of encirclement for the entire enemy grouping in the North Caucasus. The tank and mechanized corps of the Red Army, overcoming the resistance of hastily redeployed German units, continued their swift advance. The 25th Tank Corps of General Pavel Pavlovich Poluboyarov made a daring dash in a southerly direction, cutting the crucial Milerovo-Rostov railway line. The 1st Guards Mechanized Corps of General Ivan Nikitich Rusyanov reached the northern outskirts of Milerovo. The German command, realizing the strategic importance of this transport hub, hastily transferred all available reserves there. A battle group was urgently formed in Milerovo from scattered units that had retreated after the defeat of the Italian army, as well as rear and security units. Command of the group was entrusted to the experienced General Freitag Loringhoven. By December 27th, Soviet troops had completed the encirclement of the enemy's Milerovo grouping. The cauldron contained the remnants of the Italian Alpine Corps, a German infantry division, and several separate battalions, a total of about 25,000 men. Attempts to relieve the encircled grouping by forces of the SS Panzer Division Viking were repelled with heavy losses for the Germans. The operational strategic situation on the southern flank of the Soviet-German front changed dramatically. The breakthrough of Soviet troops to a depth of up to 150 kilometers created a real threat of encirclement for the entire Army Group Dawn. Manstein was forced to begin withdrawing troops from the Chir River line to the southwest to avoid complete encirclement. This decision had far-reaching consequences. Now, a gap of 200 kilometers had formed between Paulus's Sixth Army, encircled in Stalingrad, and the main forces of the Wehrmacht. Any plans to relieve the Stalingrad grouping became absolutely unrealistic. The fate of 300,000 German soldiers in the Stalingrad cauldron was finally sealed. Of particular importance was the psychological effect of the defeat of the Italian army and the advance of Soviet troops to Milerovo. In Berlin, for the first time, there was serious talk of the possibility of military defeat. Goebbels wrote in his diary on December 30th, 42, "The situation on the Eastern Front is becoming increasingly threatening. The Russians have broken through our front on a wide sector. Our allies have proven completely unreliable. The Führer is forced to redeploy German divisions to close the gaps created after the flight of the Italians and Romanians." Among all the tragedies of Operation Little Saturn, a special place is held by the fate of the Italian Alpine Corps, an elite formation, the pride of the Italian armed forces. Unlike other units of Armee, the Alpini were a truly combat-ready formation with high morale and fighting traditions. 3 divisions, Tridentina, Giulia, and Cuniense, numbered about 60,000 selected mountain riflemen who had combat experience in the harsh conditions of the Alps. However, even their professionalism and resilience proved powerless against the catastrophe unfolding on the Don. When the main part of the Italian Eighth Army was defeated, the Alpine Corps under the command of General Nasci found itself in a strategic trap. Initially occupying positions in the rear, on the second line of defense, the Alpini were not subjected to the first strike of Soviet troops. But this only delayed their tragedy. On January 15, 1943, the Soviet command launched a new operation, Ostrogozhsk-Rossosh Offensive, which finally decided the fate of the Alpine Corps. Surrounded on all sides, cut off from the main forces of the Wehrmacht, the Alpine riflemen decided to break through to the west. Thus began the legendary March to Immortality, one of the most dramatic pages of World War II. Columns of Alpini moved across snow-covered steppes, covering distances of 30 to 40 kilometers a day in 30-degree frost. They had almost no heavy weapons, lacking ammunition, food, and medicine. Thousands of wounded and frostbitten dragged themselves in improvised sleds, pulled by the last surviving horses and mules. The Giulia division was the first to be hit by Soviet tank units near the village of Arbuzovka. In fierce combat, the Alpini managed to break through the first encirclement ring, but lost almost half of their personnel. The division commander, General Battisti, was captured. The remaining soldiers joined the column of the Cuniense division. The Cuniense division, considered the best in the Alpine Corps, was intercepted by units of the 6th Soviet Army near the village of Veluki. In an unequal battle, the Alpini showed exceptional courage. The Dronero battalion was completely destroyed, covering the retreat of the main forces. The battalion commander, Major Zaro, wounded in both legs, continued to lead the battle until the last bullet, and then shot himself to avoid capture. Of the 15,000 men of the Cuniense division, only about 1,200 reached the final destination, the city of Shebekino. The Tridentina division under the command of General Reverberi found itself in the most advantageous position, being at the vanguard of the retreating column. On January 26th, the Alpini of this division reached the village of Nikolaevka, where they encountered units of the Soviet 201st Rifle Division. Realizing that this was the last frontier separating them from salvation, the Alpini launched a desperate assault. Colonel Paolo Sibilli, commander of the Edolo Regiment, personally led his soldiers into attack with the cry, "Tridentina! Forward! Whoever is alive, follow me!" Operation Little Saturn was not just a tactical success for the Soviet forces. It evolved into one of the key elements of the Red Army's strategic offensive in the winter of 1942-1943. Its significance extended far beyond the defeat of Italian troops on the Don. It was part of a large-scale plan by the Soviet High Command, aimed at achieving a fundamental turning point in the entire war. Strategically, Little Saturn organically fit into a series of consecutive operations that began with the counteroffensive near Stalingrad, Operation Uranus. If Uranus created the Stalingrad pocket, then Little Saturn made its unblocking impossible and prepared the conditions for the final elimination of Paulus's encircled grouping during Operation Koltso. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command masterfully utilized the principle of sequential buildup of efforts. Each subsequent operation developed the success of the previous one, preventing the enemy from recovering and regrouping forces. The defeat of the Italian 8th Army in mid-December 1942 allowed significant forces to be freed up for new strikes in January 1943, the Ostrogozhsk-Rossosh and Voronezh-Kastornoy operations. Simultaneously with the offensive on the Middle Don, events unfolded in the North Caucasus. On January 1, 1943, the North Caucasian Offensive operation began. The German command, forced to transfer reserves to close the gap formed after the defeat of the Italians, could not hold its positions in the Caucasus. By early February, Soviet troops had liberated most of the North Caucasus, including important oil regions. Of particular importance was the synchronization of actions of various fronts. The success of Little Saturn created a threat of encirclement for the entire Army Group Don under Field Marshal Manstein. This in turn made it impossible to transfer German reserves to save the Stalingrad grouping. On February 2, 1943, the last pockets of resistance in Stalingrad were suppressed. Operation Koltso successfully concluded. Military historians rightly note that Little Saturn became one of the first examples of the Soviet command's full application of the theory of deep operation. The combination of a powerful frontal strike with the rapid introduction of large tank and mechanized formations into the breakthrough allowed not only to breach the enemy's tactical defense zone, but also to develop tactical success into operational success. The defeat of the Italian 8th Army also had important military-political significance. It demonstrated to the whole world the vulnerability of the fascist bloc of states. Mussolini, upon receiving news of the catastrophe on the Don, seriously considered withdrawing from the war for the first time. In Berlin, it was also realized that serious help from allies could no longer be counted on. Operation Little Saturn became one of the decisive factors in achieving a fundamental turning point in the Great Patriotic War. It finally wrested the strategic initiative from the hands of the German command and created conditions for a general offensive of the Red Army along the entire front in the spring and summer of 1943. The strategy of striking at the enemy's weak links is one of the fundamental principles of military art, known since ancient times. The Soviet command, applying this principle in Operation Little Saturn, demonstrated a deep understanding of classical military theory and creatively developed it in relation to the conditions of modern warfare. Delivering the main blow against Italian and other German allied troops, instead of a direct attack on German units, was a decision based on centuries of human military experience. The ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu wrote, "Attack where it is weak, avoid what is strong." This principle runs like a red thread through the entire history of military art. The Macedonian king Philip, father of Alexander the Great, conquering Greece, always chose the weakest of the poleis for attack, gradually isolating the strongest. Hannibal in the Battle of Cannae concentrated his shock cavalry against auxiliary Roman units, and not against the legions. Napoleon masterfully used the principle of divide and conquer, consistently defeating the disparate armies of the coalition. Operation Little Saturn stands alongside these classic examples of strategic thinking. The Soviet command unerringly determined that the Italian 8th Army represented the most vulnerable link in the enemy's formation. Instead of attacking powerful German tank groupings, Stavka directed the main blow against Italian positions. The result exceeded all expectations. The front was breached to a depth of up to 150 kilometers, which created a threat of encirclement of the entire Army Group Don. The effectiveness of such a strategy is determined by several factors. Firstly, striking at a weak link requires fewer forces and resources to achieve a breakthrough. Secondly, breaking through defenses in one sector creates a threat to the flanks and rear of neighboring enemy groupings, forcing them to retreat. Thirdly, the defeat of Allied contingents has not only military, but also political significance, undermining the unity of the enemy coalition. All these advantages were fully manifested during Operation Little Saturn. The defeat of the Italian Eighth Army led to the disorganization of the entire front of Army Group Dawn, thwarted the operation to relieve the encircled Paulus grouping, and created the prerequisites for the further offensive of the Red Army. The military-political consequences of the defeat of Germany's Allied armies on the Eastern Front proved to be truly dramatic. The catastrophe of the Italian Eighth Army on the Don became one of the reasons for the fall of Mussolini's regime in July 1943, and Italy's subsequent withdrawal from the war. Romania and Hungary, having lost a significant part of their armies in the winter of 42-43, began secret contacts with the Allies about the possibility of a separate peace. Hitler was forced to transfer additional German divisions to the Eastern Front, weakening other directions. The strategy of striking at the weak links of the enemy coalition was further developed in subsequent operations of the Red Army. In the Belarusian operation of 1944, the main blows were delivered against sectors where Hungarian and Romanian units were defending. In the Jassy-Kishinev operation of the same year, the Romanian troops were finally defeated, which led to Romania's withdrawal from the war and its transition to the side of the anti-Hitler coalition. The experience of Operation Little Saturn has enduring significance for military theory and practice. It demonstrates the importance of careful analysis of the enemy, identifying its weaknesses, and concentrating efforts in decisive directions. This experience proves that in modern warfare, victory is achieved not only by superiority in forces and means, but also by a skillful choice of the direction of the main blow. The catastrophe of the Italian Eighth Army on the Don had far-reaching political consequences, extending beyond a purely military defeat. For Italy, this tragedy marked the beginning of the end for Benito Mussolini's fascist regime, which had ruled the country for over 20 years. News of Armir's rout shook Italian society to its core. Tens of thousands of families received death notices or reports of missing persons. In every town, in every village, sons, husbands, and brothers who had died on the distant banks of the Don were mourned. Mussolini, realizing the catastrophic scale of the defeat, tried to conceal the truth from the people. Official reports spoke only of a temporary retreat and a planned straightening of the front line. But it was impossible to hide a tragedy of such magnitude. Letters from surviving soldiers and stories from returning wounded painted a completely different picture, one of complete rout and chaotic flight. By the spring of 1943, the first anti-war demonstrations began in Italy. Slogans appeared on house walls. "Bring back our sons!" and "Down with the war!" Even among the fascist party's elite, discontent was brewing. Many hierarchs had lost relatives in the Russian steppes and now questioned, for what were these sacrifices made? Count Ciano, foreign minister and Mussolini's son-in-law, wrote in his diary, "The Russian catastrophe could be the beginning of the end of the regime. The Duce looks depressed and confused. He no longer controls the situation." Italo-German relations sharply deteriorated after Armir's defeat. Hitler openly accused the Italians of cowardice and inability to fight. Mussolini, in turn, blamed the German command for the defeat, claiming they had placed Italian divisions in an unfavorable position and failed to provide them with necessary armaments and equipment. Mutual accusations undermined the unity of the Berlin-Rome axis. In July 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. The Italian army, demoralized by defeats in Russia and North Africa, offered almost no resistance. On July 25th, the Grand Council of Fascism voted to remove Mussolini from power. King Victor Emmanuel III signed the decree for his arrest. Marshal Badoglio's new government immediately began secret negotiations to withdraw from the war. On September 8, 1943, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies and declared war on Germany. Thus, the rout on the Don led to the collapse of the fascist regime and Italy's exit from the war. For Germany, the loss of its Italian ally was a heavy blow. Now, the Wehrmacht not only had to fight on the Eastern Front but also occupy Italy and defend its coastline from possible Allied landings. This required additional divisions, which were so desperately needed on other fronts. Hitler was forced to fundamentally revise his military-political strategy. After the defeat of the Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian armies on the Eastern Front, the Führer no longer trusted his allies. He abandoned the formation of large units from satellite troops, preferring to use them as auxiliary units, mixed with German divisions. This allowed him to control unreliable allies, but reduced the overall effectiveness of combat operations. Operation Little Saturn became one of the brightest examples of 20th century military art, whose lessons are relevant even today. The defeat of the Italian army on the Don in December of '42 not only changed the course of the Battle of Stalingrad, it demonstrated a fundamental principle of strategy that retains its value regardless of era and technology: identifying and exploiting the enemy's weak links. What did this operation show modern military theorists? First and foremost, the importance of systemic analysis of the enemy. The Soviet command brilliantly identified not only the tactical but also the strategic vulnerability of the enemy coalition. Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian contingents were weak, not only due to outdated weaponry or insufficient training. Their main weakness lay in the lack of motivation. Soldiers of these countries did not understand what they were fighting for in the Russian steppes. The second crucial lesson is an asymmetric response to a threat. Instead of engaging in a head-on collision with Manstein's tank divisions, the Soviet command struck the flank defended by the Italians. This is a classic example of indirect action, where the result is achieved not by concentrating force against force, but by choosing the path of least resistance. The third lesson concerns inter-allied relations in military coalitions. Germany, relying on its satellites, did not provide them with the necessary support, neither material nor technical. The Italians were left to their fate with outdated weapons and without winter uniforms. The history of Little Saturn shows neglecting the preparation of Allied armies inevitably turns into a strategic catastrophe for the entire coalition. The fourth lesson is related to the psychological effect. The defeat of the Italian army had a colossal moral and psychological impact, not only on the enemy troops, but also on its political leadership. It undermined the Italian people's faith in the fascist regime and marked the beginning of the end for Mussolini. Modern military strategists must consider that a blow to a weak link can have a disproportionately strong political effect. The fifth lesson is the significance of operational depth. The Soviet command was not limited to a tactical breakthrough of the Italian defenses. It developed the success by introducing mobile formations into the breakthrough, which entered operational space and disorganized the entire enemy rear. This demonstrates the importance of not only breaking through the front, but also developing success in depth. Finally, Little Saturn showed the importance of choosing the right moment to strike. The operation began precisely when the German command threw all its forces into relieving Stalingrad and could not quickly transfer reserves to save the Italians. Today, in an era of hybrid wars and a multipolar world, these lessons take on new meaning. Modern military coalitions face the same problems: differences in the training, equipment, and motivation of Allied contingents. The strategy of identifying and exploiting the enemy's weak links remains relevant, although it is implemented using new technologies and methods. The history of Operation Little Saturn reminds us, in military art, there are no trifles. Neglecting the preparation of allies, underestimating the enemy, ignoring climatic conditions. Any of these factors can lead to catastrophe. Conversely, careful analysis of enemy weaknesses and concentration of efforts in the decisive direction can bring victory even with a relative equality of forces.